You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
The Sephora Savings Event is coming. Are you ready to get
this and that? I don't gotta choose.
You're right. You don't. Shop all your favorite makeup, skincare, hair care, and fragrances for less. Find brands like Rare Beauty, Glow Recipe, Valentino, K18, and everything else you want on sale starting November 1st. The Sephora Savings Event is almost here. Shop the sale at Sephora and Sephora at Kohl's. Limitations apply. Must be a beauty insider. See terms at Sephora.com for complete details.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 197, The Fall of France, Operation Dynamo. This week, a big thank you goes out to Michael for the donation and to Fiddlar2000, Michael, and Joseph for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. You can find out more about becoming a member over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. After the first 3 days of Operation Dynamo, which was the code name for the operation to evacuate British and French troops from Dunkirk, around 58,000 men had been evacuated. This was already an impressive number after 3 days, but there would be 5 more days of evacuation to follow. Over those 5 days, there would be 3 critically important tasks that had to be performed if the maximum number of soldiers were to be brought out of harm's way. The first and obvious of these tasks is that the sailors and those ashore had to coordinate their efforts as best as they possibly could. And to this end, Captain William Tennant came ashore on the second day of Operation Dynamo to coordinate the shoreside efforts of the Royal Navy to get men into boats. The second task was to keep the Luftwaffe away from the evacuation, a task to be performed by the Royal Air Force. The third task, and by far the most dangerous, was to keep the German ground forces away from the beaches for as long as possible. This duty fell to a combination of troops from the British and French armies that were along the Dunkirk perimeter. In my mind, and you will not change my mind about this, just for the record, it would be these men that are the true heroes of Dunkirk. For a critical 5 days, the British and French soldiers would hold off German attacks as best as they could, even though every day that they stayed on the line reduced the likelihood that they themselves would be evacuated. It was a tough job, but somebody, quite literally, had to do it, and they did. In the air, the fighting would continue, and here I will include a quote from Pilot Officer Alan Wright of 92 Squadron, which I found particularly interesting, in which I completely honestly meant to have in the last episode, but it got kind of filed away in the wrong spot in my research notes, so I'm putting it here. And the reason I like it is because it clearly shows that the pilots, just like those on the ground, were often operating in an environment where they only barely understood the situation, and were mostly just acting based on vague instructions from officers above about what to do. Here is the quote. During the week or so of Dunkirk, briefings were almost nil, either about the enemy on the ground or in the air. At the time, the system of thorough aircrew briefings had not been thought of. We were, however, given the limits of our patrol area, warned not to patrol below 10,000 feet, and told to attack any German aircraft seen. We were also warned to conserve fuel and to leave the battle area with sufficient fuel to get back, not easy to assess in the heat of battle. No information at all was given on what was going on down there until it was all over and our troops had already landed back in England. End quote. I like this quote, again, because it shows that, the pilots in the air, or at least Pilot Officer Alan Wright and some of those that he flew with, had no idea that they were kind of taking part in some, amazing historic operation to evacuate troops. They were told to go to a place, hunt German planes, shoot any that they saw, and make sure they got back. And that's what they did. During May the 30th, there would be serious discussions among some staff officers at BEF headquarters about the best way to surrender to the Germans. The reason for these conversations was due to the estimations of how many men would be able to actually escape the coming German attacks, with the general estimates being far below the number of men that would eventually be saved. On that night, Lord Gort, the BEF's commander, would announce that he had been ordered back to England, an order that he had spoken against, but he really had little choice. The mere possibility of such a high-ranking British officer being captured by the Germans had to be avoided at all costs, if only due to the propaganda possibilities that it would give to the enemy. Along with Gort, the commander of the 2nd Corps, General Alan Brooke, was also scheduled to leave. But before he did, he would meet with the commander of the 50th Division, which would be moved from the 2nd Corps, which Alan Brooke commanded, to the 1st Corps, which would be assigned to the perimeter defense, while the 2nd Corps was scheduled to begin evacuation on the next day. In this conversation with the 50th Division's commander, General Martel, Brooke would say that he did not know what message Martel should give to his officers, because they both believed that there was very little chance that many of the 50th's men, if any of them, would be evacuated. Now this is skipping ahead a little bit, but the 50th Division would actually be evacuated on June 1st, which I find interesting because I think it says something about the expectations of the British military officers that were within the Dunkirk perimeter, with the conversation between Brooke and Martel happening just over 24 hours before the 50th was evacuated, and even that span of time seemed to be more than what many British officers expected to have when it came to further time to evacuate. Now, while all of those conversations were happening at BEF headquarters, in the air, the 30th would be a relatively quiet date due to the weather conditions that prevailed over Dunkirk, with mist, clouds, and smoke from Dunkirk itself making all sort of air operations either difficult or impossible. Here is Flight Lieutenant J. Ellis of 610 Squadron again. Quote, "On 30th May, I led a formation of 4 Spitfire squadrons on an offensive patrol over Dunkirk. The other 3 squadrons were from Hornchurch and North Weald. Weather conditions were not good with poor visibility. We saw some Me-110s, but before we could attack them, they disappeared into cloud. In the afternoon of the same day, we again patrolled Dunkirk with the same 4 Spitfire squadrons, but it was so hazy that we could hardly see the coast. As usual, we encountered heavy AK fire from our own forces, but we saw no enemy aircraft." End quote. On the 30th, Lord Gort and the Chief of the British Air Staff would both send messages to the RAF commanders to thank them for the work that their men had done and were continuing to do. Gort would write, quote, "Extremely grateful for valuable work of RAF. Presence and action of fighters is of first importance in preventing embarkation being interrupted and is having most heartening effect on troops." End quote. While the Chief of the Air Staff would write, quote, "I wish to express to you my warmest congratulations on the successes achieved by all units during the critical period of the last 48 hours, and my profound appreciation of the effort which you have been able to sustain. The messages from Lord Gort and VA Dover will show you clearly how vital effect your air support is during the continuance of the present operation, and I count on all ranks to continue to do their utmost to help the Navy and the Army, who are fighting most gallantly under conditions of extreme difficulty." End quote. While these messages were being exchanged and the leaders in London were trying to keep Operation Dynamo going, and Gort and other British officers were working on details of evacuating as many soldiers as possible, there was one problem that they would have to find a path forward on. It was very important, and it was called the French. The British and French were allies. So far, they had worked pretty close together, and they'd done a pretty good job before and during the war. They both saw each other as an essential part of achieving victory over Germany, but there were some harsh realities that were entering into the decision-making processes in London and at BEF headquarters. The first reality was that any troops that were not evacuated would either be killed or forced to surrender. That was a simple fact. No one could or would have disputed it. The second was that with the defeats that had already been suffered by the French military, it seemed very likely that they would be forced to surrender regardless of the outcome of the evacuations. The third was that once France was defeated, Germany's eyes would inevitably turn to Britain. These facts were then mixed in with a bit of politics, with some in London heavily valuing relations with France, while some believed that pure priority should be given to British troops in the evacuation. This was the crux of the problem, where all of these kind of different facets and features and thought processes came together. How should the available evacuation resources be shared between British and French forces? In retrospect, this seems like less of a problem than it did at the time because of how many men were evacuated before June 4th. However, on May 30th and May 31st, when these conversations were happening, the feeling was that the evacuation may be forced to end at any moment. When they ended, probably due to German attacks onto the beaches, every single soldier left behind would be killed or forced to surrender, regardless of which nation they were from. If you were a British leader who believed that the French were doomed, you advocated for maximum possible efforts being made to evacuate only British soldiers, because they would be needed to defend Britain in the months that followed. If you were a British leader who had not yet given up on France, then it was important to also evacuate French forces due to political reasons, if nothing else. And there were also military reasons to evacuate them as well, since they could be moved to French ports and still play a role in future defensive campaigns. During the critical days of May 30th and the 31st, this second group would be the one to make the decisions. And so on the 30th, Gort was told that a fair number of places should be given over to the French on the evacuation ships, although the exact definition of fair was still up in the air. However, this guidance was very flimsy, and it was generally felt by the French officers in Dunkirk that they were not being given fair treatment. One area where this would come into play was the exact composition of the units that were protecting the Dunkirk perimeter. Troops were needed to hold off the German ground assault, but the French did not believe that the British were doing their fair share, and because of this, not enough French forces were being evacuated because they were stuck in defensive lines protecting the evacuation beaches. The French Admiral Abrial, who was one of the two men kind of in charge of French military forces at this time in and around Dunkirk, would say of one very contentious meeting between himself and the commander of British forces in Dunkirk, General Alexander, that, quote, "Since we cannot count on English cooperation, General, I will fulfill my mission using French troops. We French have a mission which is to fight to the last man to save as many soldiers as possible from Dunkirk. Until we have achieved this goal, we will remain at our posts." End quote. On the British side, Alexander would later recount that the differences in opinion between the British and French ran much deeper than just how many of each nationality was getting off the beaches. Alexander would say that Abrial and some of the French soldiers disagreed with the entire concept that combat-capable troops should be evacuating at that time, preferring instead to have all of the combat troops remain in the line while non-combatants were evacuated, because the longer that the line was held, the more troops might be able to sort of make their way to the Dunkirk perimeter, that's British and French troops, so that they could be evacuated. Part of this misunderstanding was down to the lack of clarity in orders being received from Weygand and Paris during this period, with a hesitancy by the French High Command to fully commit to the evacuation and to make it clear that evacuation was the purpose of continued French resistance in the area. The British military leaders in Dunkirk were also receiving somewhat contradictory instructions from London. For example, one War Cabinet meeting in the evening of May 31st would have in the minutes that, quote, "It would be entirely wrong to sacrifice our men by attempting to hold out longer in order to please the French," end quote. But then the written orders that were sent out as a result of that meeting would say, quote, "You should withdraw your force as rapidly as possible on a 50-50 basis with the French, aiming at completion by the night of 1st to 2nd June," end quote. You'll note that those orders mention sort of being in line with the French, but the British and French, officers had very different views about what they should be doing. And so it kind of pushed it back onto Alexander and the French generals to come to some kind of agreement. Now, due to conversations at the Supreme War Council between Churchill, Weygand, and Reynaud, orders were sent that the French soldiers should be given higher priority in the evacuation, because up to that point, far more British troops had been evacuated than Frenchmen. But they still did not write up the order in a way that would result in maximum possible effort to make evacuations as soon as possible, instead saying that the areas around Dunkirk were to be held until the French commander, Abrial, believed that no further British and French troops would be able to reach the perimeter. It was only then that final evacuation should begin. This message from the Supreme War Council was in line with what Abrial and the French officers were advocating for, but were completely against what the British officers had been told or what the British officers were trying to accomplish. None of these orders from London, Paris, or anywhere else were specific and strong enough to make up for the continued difference in opinion among British and French military leaders within the perimeter of Dunkirk. On the British side, they believed their only objective was to evacuate, while the French believed that Dunkirk could still be held for several more days to hopefully allow more troops to reach them. Everything would have been solved by firm and specific orders, but every directive that was being sent to Dunkirk was couched in ambiguous clauses that put much of the decision-making process on the military leaders in Dunkirk. It also did not help that the French and British military officers had fundamentally different readings of the orders that they were receiving, resulting in one French general to later write of the French commander Alexander at this point that, quote, he was flagrantly disobeying his commander-in-chief's orders, that he was abandoning his comrades at a critical moment, that he could go ahead and embark his troops, but then that we, the French, would protect the evacuation, and that we would show him that whatever he said, we could remain for several extra days at Dunkirk without being captured, end quote. This French officer later recalls that he also told Alexander that, quote, your decision to evacuate with your 3 divisions represents a disgrace for England, end quote. As you can see, things were getting a little heated within the Dunkirk perimeter as the pressure mounted. Now, this idea that the English were abandoning the French is a really, really important idea, so kind of keep that in your head over the next 3, 4, 5, 8, 50 episodes, probably, because it really drives events in the last stages of the French campaign, and then also sort of drives some decision-making in Vichy France once the armistice happens between France and Germany.
Close your eyes and picture something cheesy and delicious. Something satisfying, ready in 3.5 minutes, like a Kraft mac and cheese cup. Available now at a store near you.
Reporting live from under my blanket, I'm Susan Curtis with Dunkin' at Home. Breaking news, pumpkin spice iced and hot coffees are back. I'll pass it to Mr. Curtis with his blanket for the full story.
That is so right, Susan. You know, it's never too early to get in a spicy mood. I'm talking cinnamony goodness that's so tasty, people don't want to leave their blankets either. Back to you.
No, back to you.
All you.
The home with Dunkin' Pumpkin Spice is where you want to be.
Even with all the disagreements happening at the political and kind of headquarters level, evacuations would continue throughout May 31st. The day would see the largest number of total soldiers evacuated, with just over 68,000 total evacuees. One of the major reasons for this large number was the fact that the day was generally quite cloudy, which prevented the full force of German air power from being felt. In fact, many of the early British fighter sweeps did not encounter any enemy aircraft at all. However, later in the day, some serious air battles would develop as the weather cleared, but this clearing also resulted in some steady seas, which made the evacuation from the beaches easier. So it was kind of a give-or-take situation. Better weather put the evacuation at greater risk of German air attack, but also made it easier and faster to evacuate. Even with limited hours of real aerial combat happening over Dunkirk, the RAF would lose 21 aircraft during the day's actions, although they would claim twice that number in German aircraft, which is of course probably far inflated from the actual number. I would say cut that in half probably, so maybe they lost roughly the same number. Information about the disagreements between the British and French military leaders would also make their way back to the leaders in both Paris and London on the 31st. For the British, this would result in a discussion at the War Cabinet meeting on June 1st, where the decision was made to attempt to complete the evacuation of the BEF that very night of June 1st. They also believed that they should place almost total priority on British troops due to seeming inefficiencies that the French were introducing into the evacuation process. Not only were they not evacuating on land as quickly as the British wanted, but French ships that were involved were also taking longer to make their trips because instead of dropping the French soldiers off at the nearest British port, which the British government fully supported and advocated for, The French instead wanted to take them further away to French ports like Le Havre. It was understandable why the French wanted to take French soldiers to a French port, but it slowed the evacuation process of the troops considerably. During this meeting, it was believed that if the maximum possible priority was given to British soldiers, every effort was made that the evacuation of the BEF could be completed on the night of June 1st. This information was then sent to the British ships, with the plan also being communicated to continue to evacuate the French troops for as long after the BEF was safely off the beaches as was possible, hopefully just a few more days. In Dunkirk, even though the commanders disagreed on some things, they continued to work closely together. On the morning of June 1st, with the final stages of the British evacuation seeming to be at hand, Alexander informed the French that his plan was for his troops to fall back further during that night, abandoning the canal line that they had been holding over the previous days. From there, they would create a smaller inner perimeter on their sector of the front, which they would hold on the 2nd of June if any of his troops could not get away during the night. If any BEF troops then remained on June 2nd, they would be evacuated the following evening. The support of the French was absolutely critical at this stage because there would only be a few thousand British troops that made up the rear guard behind the evacuating First Corps, and they would be totally dependent on the French holding their sector of the line and also providing assistance on the British sector that would be almost completely unguarded. In the air, a major operation by the Germans was mounted against the ships that were moving back and forth between Dunkirk and the English Channel. This included several raids by German bombers early in the morning, and then a raid by Stukas against Dunkirk harbor, and then the nearby shipping in the afternoon. Multiple ships were damaged, and almost more importantly, the evacuation operations were slowed due to the disorganization caused by the attacks. Even with these disruptions, another 60,000 men would be evacuated throughout the day and into the night of June 1st. And the next day, June 2nd, was much the same, with the British trying to make sure that all of their forces were evacuated during the day and into the night, with another 26,000 men brought aboard ships. This was mostly successful, and as evening fell on the 2nd, efforts were made to ensure that any British soldiers that had been left behind, either in the town or on the beaches or in the harbor, were found and brought on board ships. At 11:30 p.m., Tennant, who had been managing the evacuation for several days, was able to send the signal to Dover that the BEF had been evacuated. French soldiers were continuing to be evacuated as well, with one of the challenges being that, as the number of French soldiers rose, there was confusion because most of the ships and the men managing the evacuation operations were British. For example, there was one situation in which there were multiple ships in place with nobody getting on them, while the French were clogging up the areas around just a few of the vessels because the French soldiers believed that they were supposed to stay with their units and only to board certain ships. It took time to communicate to those men and to the units that they needed to spread out and take any ship that was available. There were also other critical communication problems happening at the very worst moments. For example, during the night of June 2nd, there were multiple ships that left Dunkirk empty because French units had been told to go to the wrong place, with the evacuation area still sort of several miles in width. If a unit was told to go to one edge of the evacuation area, but their ship was actually on the other, it was possible that they would not be able to move in time before the ship had to leave in the late morning hours before it got light to avoid German air attack. Even with all of these challenges, the final stage of the evacuation was planned for the night of June 3rd, with the remaining French soldiers being evacuated at that time. A schedule was worked out where the French troops holding certain areas around the perimeter would collapse back to their evacuation points at very specific times, with the general thinning out of the line to start at 8:30 p.m. It would not be until the early hours of the morning on June 4th that the final French troops, a sort of thin crust of troops, still at least making it appear that the line was being manned, would also move to the harbor and beaches for their own evacuation. Unfortunately, for many of these troops, while there was every effort made to try to ensure that they were evacuated, many would not be. The problem was that on the night of June 3rd and into the 4th, there simply were not enough ships available to get all the soldiers out. This meant that when the final rearguard troops retreated to their evacuation points at around 2:30 a.m., instead of finding ships waiting for them, they instead simply found themselves at the end of a lengthy line of troops that had been scheduled for earlier evacuation, but which had not been. The French commander of the final French troops to evacuate or try to evacuate at this time would later recall his thoughts, quote, "The stars are growing paler. The sky is growing lighter. The new day is dawning. The crowd on the jetty moves forward very slowly. I cannot see any boats at the end of the jetty." End quote. No real thought had been given to what to do in the situation that the French troops found themselves in. It had been clear for hours before that not all the troops were going to be evacuated that night, but there was no effort sort of put into trying to halt the retreat from the inner perimeter, or to otherwise form some kind of defensive line to maybe try again the next night. Instead, the thousands of French soldiers that remained simply were left to wait near the water for their eventual capture. That capture would occur thanks to the German 18th Infantry Division, which would begin entering Dunkirk on the morning of June 4th, with nothing remaining, really, between them and the beaches. They found 40,000 French troops still remaining, with all of them taken prisoner. At roughly the same time that the Germans were rounding up their prisoners, the following telegram would be sent to French High Command from London to give them some information about the actions of the previous night. Quote, "Number of men evacuated last night were probably as many as 25,000. The evacuation started with the Germans in Rosendale and finished under the fire of German machine guns. Nothing more could have been done." End quote. After 9 days and nights, Operation Dynamo had finally concluded. The original estimates were that 45,000 troops could be evacuated before the Germans took Dunkirk, that being the estimate provided to the British government. But in the final accounting of the numbers, it would be around 330,000 men from the British and French armies that were brought out of Dunkirk and either brought back to Britain or to France. Now, there is some range in that number, probably caused by the general disorganization experienced by the units during the evacuation. And you'll find sources using numbers between 300,000 and 350,000. I give 330,000 here because that seems to be the most consistent. It really doesn't matter what the exact number was, though. It was still a tremendous number of troops, with many of the French troops that were taken to England being moved to Cherbourg or Brest within a few days, while in Britain, the soldiers began the process of being reorganized. But even with all the units that were evacuated, and which would be able to escape, many long years in German prisoner of war camps, Operation Dynamo wasn't really a victory. It was perhaps better described as a slightly worse disaster. Because while the men were evacuated, all of their equipment and most of their weapons were left scattered in the areas around the beaches. Tanks, trucks, artillery guns, rifles, kits, all would have to be replaced before the men who were evacuated could once again resume their role as soldiers. The problem is that all of those things would take time, and time was something that the British and French simply did not have. Because Dunkirk was not the end, but it was perhaps the beginning of the end. France was not yet defeated, but on both sides of the English Channel the question became, how do we save ourselves from what comes next?